So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand you off to our founder and executive director, Nathaniel Stinnett.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you so much. And wow, thank you to all of you. What an awesome crowd we already have this evening. Thank you all so much for spending your time with us tonight. And we are going to learn a lot about the power that climate and environmental voters have in North Carolina this year. So, if you're anything like me, you like to know what's coming. And so this slide here tells you what's coming tonight as part of this briefing and fundraiser. I'm going to start with a very quick intro to the Environmental Voter Project. For those of you who are brand new to EVP, please forgive me. This is not going to go through in detail all that we do and how we do it. This is meant as a very, very quick refresher for those of you who are not, I'm sorry, for those of you who already know about the Environmental Voter Project. Then we're going to spend most of our time diving into our data about North Carolina and the opportunities that are presented to volunteers and donors in supporting voter turnout efforts in North Carolina. And then, as Danielle mentioned before, we will have a Q&A session. As we go along, if you have any questions, please do put them in that Q&A folder. Danielle might answer your question there, or she might not answer your question and hold it for me at the end because she feels that it's something that I might be able to answer in a way that everybody gets something out of it. So without further ado, let's jump right into this quick intro to the Environmental Voter Project. For those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on just one thing, and that is finding environmentalists who don't vote and then turning them into consistent voters. That's it. That's what we do. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't endorse and campaign for particular candidates. We don't even, as odd as it might sound, try to convince people to care more about climate change or the environment. A good way to think of us, in fact, is we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business at all. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. What we want to do is identify voters who care so deeply about climate and the environment that they no longer need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They are already there with us, yet they aren't voting. They aren't taking this very important and impactful action. And what that then enables us to do is view these people purely through a behavioral lens. We don't need to change their mind. We just need to change their behavior. That's what we do at the Environmental Voter Project. And as I hope to show you over the next few minutes, this might seem like a narrow niche, but it's actually an enormous opportunity. Just to give you an idea of how enormous, just in our 19 states, and you see the 19 states that we work in right here on this map, just in our 19 states this year, we have already individually identified 4.8 million voters, all of whom have the following characteristics. 1, they're registered to vote already. 2, they are highly likely to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally listed as their #1 priority over all other issues. Yet 3, they are unlikely to vote this November. And we know that they're unlikely to vote this November because they didn't vote in 2020 or any election since then. 4.8 million of them. Already registered super environmentalists who need this purely behavioral intervention. And some of you might be thinking, oh my gosh, how come all these environmentalists aren't voting? And I understand the frustration that that might cause. But please view this as an enormous opportunity. Because, oh my gosh, is it hard to change people's minds about climate change. But these people don't need their minds changed. They just need their behavior changed. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not. But it is easier and it is measurable. And so what we do with the Environmental Voter Project is we find these people and we run hundreds of experiments testing which messages work best to turn them from non-voters into new voters. And we've become very, very good at this. Very, very briefly, and again, forgive me, this will be very brief because this is not an introduction to EVP webinar. This is how we go about this process. First, identification. We obviously can't speak to all 220 million registered voters across the United States and find out which of them list climate as a top priority. So what we do is we build what's called predictive models. The way this works is we will poll tens of thousands of people, ask them what their number one priority is, isolate the ones in each state who list climate as their top priority, and then we work with data scientists to try to find other people like them using behavioral data and consumer data and other publicly available data like stuff on voter files and census data. And it's a long iterative process, but at the end of it, what we are able to do is assign a score to each individual voter in a voter file, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate, but literally list it as their number one priority over all other issues. I know this sounds like a convoluted process, but I want to tell you a few things. One, this is the same way that now sophisticated political campaigns like the presidential campaigns and US Senate campaigns now target voters. Two, just so you understand how precise this method is, what we do after we build these models is we isolate the people at the very top, so the people with the greatest likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. Usually, we target the top 15%, so people with at least an 85% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. And we say, okay, data scientists, thank you very much for building this list for us. We're now going to take this top 15% and we're going to send that list to a polling company and we're going to ask them to poll these people. Just ask them one question. And that is, what's your number one most important political priority? And every time we've done that, at least 85% of the respondents have said, oh, climate change, why do you ask? That's how precise these predictive models are at helping us target voters. And I say that not to show you how good we are or how bad we are. We're just as good as everybody else at building these predictive models. It's just how precise the method has become. But what this then enables us to do is we can individually identify people with a really high likelihood of listing climate as their top priority, and then just look at their public voter files and see whether they vote or not. And we take the ones who aren't voting and we move to step 2, mobilization. Now we work with over 6,000 volunteers to canvass and call and postcard these voters. We also, as a staff, run direct mail and digital ad campaigns, all with behavioral science-informed messaging that has been tested in hundreds of what's called randomized control trials. These are like the gold standard for social science experiments. And what these experiments let us do is figure out which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists to do just one thing and one thing only, and that is turn these non-voting environmentalists into super voters. Step 3, habit reinforcement. You don't need to live behavioral science each day like we do to be able to intuitively understand that you can't change people's voting habits if you only talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big federal election going on. It just doesn't work. You need more bites at the apple than that. And so what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we truly work year-round in every election, big and small, in our 19 states to improve these people's voting habits. We work in federal, state, local elections, primaries, generals, special elections. I kid you not, we work in library trustee races. I don't think we've ever worked in a dog catcher race, but if one comes up, we'll absolutely do it. And even this year, just since January 1st, I believe we have already been active in 164 different elections, just this year. And I promise you that very few of them had anything to do with environmental policymaking. I will freely admit that. But what every single one of them did have something to do with is behavior change. Because if you are in the business of turning non-voters into new voters, how dare you let an election pass you by without using it as an opportunity to talk to your targets? And that's the approach we take at the Environmental Voter Project, because ultimately step 4 is our goal, and that is to change the electorate. What we want to do is so dramatically increase the number of environmental voters, not non-voters, but voters, that anybody running for office anywhere will look at their voter file or look at their polls and say, holy moly, where did all these environmental voters come from? Because when that starts to happen, policymakers will lead on climate, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because it will help them win elections. And ultimately, that is at the core of our theory of change, which is that politicians aren't going to wake up one day and want to address the climate crisis out of the goodness of their heart. And so what we need to do is we need to align leading on climate with politicians' electoral fortunes. What we want to do is make it as hard as possible for anybody to win an election without leading on climate. Because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. All right. If you want more information about how we target and then mobilize our voters, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/about. I believe Danielle will also be putting in the chat links to 2 mini briefing videos. These are very short videos, 7 to 10 minutes, that provide more detail on 1, how we identify voters, and 2, the types of messaging that we use that have been shown to be successful to actually increase turnout. So if you're interested in more detail on those 2 points, please feel free to look at that information. And all of that will be in the chat. All right, very briefly, I'm going to go over some of our results, and then we're going to jump to North Carolina. We work in these 19 states, as I mentioned, and we measure our impact in 2 ways. The first way is through what's called randomized control trials. Very briefly, what this means is, let's say we identify 500,000 unlikely to vote environmentalists in, say, Texas. What we do not do is immediately start messaging to all 500,000 of them. Instead, we set aside about 20% of them in a control group, and we never talk to them. Then the remaining 80%, they're the ones that we canvass and call and mail and send digital ads to, all with this behavioral science-informed messaging. Then election day happens, then voter files are updated, and then what we can see is what turnout was in what's called our treatment group. These are the people we were messaging to, and compare it to turnout in our control group, the people we did not message to, those 20% that we set aside. Now remember, they both were randomly sorted unlikely to vote environmentalists. And the only difference was some of them got our messaging and some of them didn't. And what that allows us to do is isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. Even if a presidential campaign spends $1 billion mobilizing low propensity voters in, say, North Carolina, well, we've controlled for that. Unless they hacked into our system, decided to only talk to people in our treatment group and nobody in our control group, we have controlled for that. And just in the last 4 years, We have now been active in, I believe, 950, maybe 960 different elections. And we probably increased turnout among our targets in every single one of them, but probably isn't good enough for us. And so in many of the elections where those numbers were big enough in our treatment and control group, we were able to get what's called statistically significant results. These are results that so clearly stated that we were solely responsible for increasing impact while controlling for outside variables, that we could eliminate the possibility of a random occurrence having taken place. And you'll see in 2020, and 21, and 22, and 2023, we were solely responsible for increasing turnout among these low propensity environmental voters we're targeting, as much as 1.8 percentage points in statewide general elections, 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and 5.7 percentage points in local elections. These are big numbers. Big numbers. Some of you have heard me say before, ask Donald Trump how big a deal that 1.8 percentage points is in Pennsylvania, and he'll tell you. These can make a big difference. Finally, the last thing I'll say about our impact is we also try to measure our impact not just in specific elections, but also over the long term. And since we launched back in 2015, we only launched a small proof of concept in Boston through 2016. And then in 2017, we launched for good. But even going back to 2015 with that little proof of concept, what we can now see in our voter files is that we have communicated with 10.5 million unique individual voters. Now, many of them we've communicated with over and over again in multiple elections, some of them just once, but they're 10.5 million unique individuals, each of whom, by definition, were unlikely to vote, or else we wouldn't have been talking about them. Also, they all cared so deeply about climate and the environment that it was their number one priority. And what we can see, the last time we took this measurement, which was now about 6 or 7 weeks ago, is that 1.8 million out of those 10.5, 1.8 million of them, when we look at their public voting histories, have now voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They have become super voters. They have become such consistent voters that if you were running for dog catcher, you would look at the public voter file and you'd say, oh, yeah, that person's going to vote. Got to go talk to them and knock on their door. Should probably poll them to figure out what issues they care about too. These people have gone from non-voters to super voters. And this is the metric of which we are most proud. Now, I want to be clear. This is different from the previous metric. This is different from the randomized control trial. I can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.8 million non-voters into super voters. For a bunch of reasons, it's very difficult to run multi-year randomized control trials when you're always trying to isolate unlikely voters. But we're pretty darn responsible. There's no other organization that's now been active in close to 2,000 different elections since 2015. Teeny little ones, big ones, and everything in between. We are putting in the work, and this is the results. All right, if you want more data about our impact results, boy, do we have a lot of reports on our website. Reports about individual messaging experiments and also annual impact reports. And you can find that information at environmentalvoter.org/results. And you'll also be able to find that link in the chat. All right, as I said, this is not meant to be a really in-depth introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. And so if you do want more information, you will be able to find in the chat a link to a video webinar, which is an hour-long introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. For those of you who are interested in that, you can find it in the chat. But for now, we're going to North Carolina. All right. So let's dive into this data that we found in our predictive modeling in North Carolina. Remember, I told you we build these predictive models that individually identify voters who don't just care about climate, but list it as their number one priority. Well, to start with, here's sort of a broad overview of, of what we found. We will be targeting over the next 5 months 266,227 of these already registered climate first voters who are unlikely to show up this fall without a robust campaign mobilizing them to do so. And when I say we are targeting, that means we've already set aside our control group of about 35, 40,000 of these low propensity environmental voters. So the 266,000 that's left, that's our treatment group. These are the ones we are messaging to. Okay, so what does that mean? What's the context for a number like that? Well, only about 5.5 million ballots were cast in 2020 for the presidential election in North Carolina. And Donald Trump only won North Carolina by 74,000 votes. Most people don't realize that North Carolina was extraordinarily close. Extraordinarily close. Moreover, this year, there are a lot of competitive elections in North Carolina. President, governor, attorney general, secretary of state, agriculture commissioner. There's so many of these that are either hotly contested or wide open races. The first congressional district, and we're going to get into some more data about that specific district in another slide or two. Not to mention, the state Senate and state House of Representatives both have a very, very interesting dynamic that we're going to get into in later slides. But North Carolina is not getting the attention that some of these other battleground states are getting, like the Pennsylvanias and Michigans and Wisconsins, in part because it hasn't been as close in 2016 and 2020 and 2016 as people think. Also, it doesn't have a US Senate race going on this year, but boy, are these other races really, really important. And yes, it is in play for the presidential. Now, North Carolina has already had its presidential primary and state primary. It does have the general election coming up on November 5th, like every other state. What is somewhat unique about North Carolina, though, is that it does have a pretty big early voting window. You can see early voting lasts from October 17th to November 2nd, 17-day early voting window. This is so important for voter turnout organizations like ours. Because remember earlier on, I alluded to the fact that whether people vote or not is public record. Well, when you vote early, the amount of time it takes between you having voted and us at the Environmental Voter Project knowing that you voted usually is only about 24 hours. Now, it takes a lot longer for us to find out who voted on election day or voted by mail, depending on the state. But if you vote early, we can find out almost immediately that you voted. We never know who you voted for, but we do see whether you voted or not. And so what's great about having a really big early voting window is not only does it enable us to communicate with people for 17 days before the actual election day, saying, hey, you can go in and vote right now. Here's how you do it. But every day we can reduce our target population by eliminating all those targets of ours who we know have already voted. Why am I bringing this up? Well, it's important for you as donors and as volunteers. I want to make sure that you know if you're picking up the phone or knocking on a door or sending a postcard to one of our voters, that if we are able to find out that they have already voted, we're going to immediately remove them from our contact universe. They obviously don't need turnout messaging anymore. And if you are a donor, you should know that your money is not going to go towards mobilizing people who have already voted. We have access to that real-time information, and that enables us to be especially efficient in a place like North Carolina. All right, the next thing I want to get into is what are the demographic characteristics of these low propensity environmental voters in North Carolina? So I'd like to bring your attention to this chart at the bottom of the slide here. First, though, please look at the very bottom row that says Reg voters. What this shows is the demographic cross-section of all registered voters in North Carolina. So the way to read this slide is, you see up here, 18 to 24-year-olds, and then down here, the number 10.1. What that means is 10.1% of registered voters in North Carolina are between the ages of 18 to 24. You go to the next square, 17.5% of registered voters in North Carolina are between the ages of 25 to 34. And then you'll see it goes all the way across. We get into sex data, we get into race data. And that gives you the demographic cross-section of all registered voters in North Carolina. We want to provide that as a baseline so you have some context when I tell you what's on the row above that. What's on the row above that, LPEVs, that stands for low propensity environmental voters. These are the people we are targeting. Now, bear in mind, they are also registered to vote, so they are a subsection of that bottom row. But you can see there are some pretty significant differences. And the first one that likely pops out at you is, oh my gosh, is our target population disproportionately young? If you combine these youngest two age groups, 18 to 34-year-olds, 89% of them, 89% of them are 18 to 34. 89% of all the low propensity environmental voters in North Carolina are 18 to 34. That compares to only 28% of registered voters in North Carolina between 18 to 34. So yeah, probably comes as no surprise to you that low propensity environmentalists are disproportionately young, but I need to tell you, this is more dramatic than what we see in most other states. In most of our states, maybe 70 or 80% of these low propensity environmental voters are under the age of 35. In North Carolina, it's almost 90%. Second thing I'll point out is look how low a percentage of 50 to 64-year-olds are in our target universe, these low propensity environmental voters. That is also something that we see in all of our other states, but again, rarely in as dramatic a drop-off as this. Maybe in other states, 2 to 5% of our targets, maybe a little less than that, 1 to 3% of our targets will be in this age range. Here, it's 0.5% in North Carolina. And then it bumps back up a little bit, 65 and up. Again, something that we see in other states. If we look at sex data, you'll see there's a gender gap. So women are more likely than men to be these low propensity environmental voters, but we pretty much see that same gender gap in the underlying baseline of registered voters in North Carolina. So the truth is that there's nothing disproportionate about that. All right, now let's go to the racial breakdowns. You'll see North Carolina is a very white state. 69% of registered voters in North Carolina are white, but only 38% of our targets are white. Another way to think of this is white voters outnumber black voters in North Carolina by more than 3 to 1. More than 3 to 1. But in our target population, there are actually more black voters than white voters. 43% of our target population is black, only 38% is white. This is something that is dramatic in North Carolina, but we also see in other states. In all of our states, people of color are disproportionately represented in our target population, especially black voters and AAPI voters. So we're starting to see kind of a trend here, right? North Carolina is like the other states, but only more so, in a more dramatic fashion. You'll also notice Hispanic voters are disproportionately represented in our target population. That would have been something that we saw in all of our states maybe 2 or 4 years ago. Now it's getting to be more of a mixed bag. We don't really see that anymore in Florida. We barely see it in Nevada. We see it in Arizona, a little bit less so in Texas, not in Pennsylvania. And so it's becoming more of a mixed bag. It's getting harder and harder to speak about Hispanic voters in anything approaching sort of monolithic statements. You'll also see AAPI voters are disproportionately represented in our target population. Native American voters aren't. This is the final thing that I want to bring up here. In almost every one of our states, Native American voters are disproportionately represented in our target population. I believe North Carolina is the only state where there is actually a smaller percentage of Native Americans in our target population than there is in the overall population of registered voters. Although I'm sure many of you are saying, it's only 0.1 percentage points. And you're right, it's a very small difference. But this actually reveals something that some of you who are very familiar with North Carolina might know, but many of you who might not be familiar with North Carolina don't know. And that is that the Lumbee tribe, so the Lumbee tribe of Native Americans, which is along the Lumbee River, kind of between sort of the border with South Carolina and Fayetteville. It is, I believe, the largest Native American tribe east of the Mississippi, maybe 50 to 70,000 people. And it is very, very politically conservative, unlike most other Native American tribes in the United States, and certainly tribes west of the Mississippi. And, this is not an insignificant population when it comes to statewide elections. 50 to 70,000 people is a big, big number. But it's something that I thought was worth mentioning because of how conservative overall the Lumbee tribe is with their voting patterns. They are much less likely to list climate and the environment as their number one priority, especially compared to many other Native American tribes. All right, that's sort of a demographic picture of these low propensity environmental voters in North Carolina. And again, thank you, all of you, for putting questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to do that. Danielle will answer some of them. Others she's going to save for the Q&A session in a bit. Okay, more North Carolina data. I can't get into the long and tortured history of the dozens of maps, districting maps that North Carolina has had to deal with just in the last few years. Not just state legislative maps, but congressional maps. This most recent map, which is not even a year old, has left the congressional districts grossly gerrymandered. Grossly gerrymandered. I mean, just think of what I said a few minutes ago, which was that North Carolina was, I think, maybe the fourth closest state in the 2020 presidential election, only decided by 70,000 votes. You would think that in a state that is essentially a 50-50 state, it wouldn't be as grossly gerrymandered as this, where almost all of the districts are red, a few dark blues, and only one competitive district. But that's where gerrymandering has left us, and that's where the Supreme Court has left us. What that means is, although there are an enormous number of important statewide and state legislative races in North Carolina this year, there is really only one competitive congressional district, and that's the first district up here. Don Davis, a Democrat, is defending it. It's only a D+3 district. What that means is, compared to the national average of congressional districts over the last 4 federal elections, this one leans on average 3 points Democratic. Not a lot. We are targeting 16,487 voters in that district. just to give you an idea of this is a very competitive district, and we happen to have a decent number of targets there. Pretty good number of targets. Okay. This obviously is not a map with 266,000 dots on it. This is a map with about 5,000 dots on it, trying to represent a sample of where our targets are. Again, for those of you who are familiar with the geography of North Carolina, you'll almost immediately recognize that this population of people we're targeting is very urban. They are also somewhat suburban, somewhat more so in North Carolina than in other states, and not that many of these low propensity climate first voters live in rural or exurban areas. Certainly some of them do. Certainly some of them do, but not many, not many. All right. I wanted to briefly just give you an overview of the state legislative outlook in North Carolina. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through 170 different races. But what I will say is this. In both the state Senate and the state House of Representatives, Republicans hold veto-proof majorities. That means they can override any law signed by, or any veto of a law by the current Democratic governor. Now, the Democratic governor is term limited, so it's an open race. But certainly it will be important, regardless of who the next governor is, regardless of what party they are, to see what happens in the state Senate and the state House. Because if Democrats can just take even one seat in both of those houses of the legislature, they can really, really change the power dynamics in what is otherwise, as I mentioned, this 50-50 state that has been grossly gerrymandered into something that has a lot of Republican power. And so that's another thing to really, really pay attention to. And when you put all of this together, so North Carolina being important for the presidency, North Carolina being important for governor and attorney general and all of these other statewide races, North Carolina having a really, really sort of knife's edge veto-proof majority for Republicans in both the state Senate and the state House, and a decent number of actually competitive races in both the state Senate and the state House. What that means is almost every voter in North Carolina, when they take their ballot and they start filling it out, whether it's early or at home or on election day, they are going to be voting on multiple elections up and down the ballot that are both crucially important and really competitive. And so North Carolina is one of these states where your dollar goes a long, long way. You are not just impacting the outcome of an election. You are impacting the outcome of multiple elections each time you are able to contact a voter. Every mail piece, every digital ad, every call or postcard we are able to deliver to these non-voting environmentalists is going to ripple across multiple elections and multiple policy-making authorities. This is what we're looking at with these 266,000, I believe it was, targets. We want to spend almost $900,000 in North Carolina. Now, we've already spent some of that because we think it's really efficient to spend money in primaries. And so we spent some money sending postcards and calling these voters earlier this year in their primary. It's actually pretty cheap to turn non-voters into new voters in a primary. But the overwhelming majority of this budget is being saved for what you see here. Starting this month, we will be calling voters in North Carolina, these non-voting environmentalists, to help them sign up to get ballots mailed to them if they want to. What's really great about this is that one, it overcomes the inconvenience for a lot of people, especially young people, in voting on election day or otherwise voting early in person. It's also important because we can see who ultimately requests a ballot. And we can warn them that it's about to show up. We can follow up with them after we think it's supposed to have arrived and make sure it's arrived and they didn't throw it out. It just gives us a bunch more really important hooks into these voters to make sure that they ultimately turn out. And so we will be starting, I believe, next week, maybe it's the week after, this vote by mail recruitment phone campaigns in North Carolina. We will also be running typical get out the vote robust phone campaigns to these. I believe we have phone numbers for over 220,000 of these voters in October and November. We will be running robust digital ads, both video ads and display ads across multiple digital media, and robust direct mail campaigns as well. This $895,000 might not seem like a lot to many of you, but remember, we're only targeting 250, 260,000 people. This would be equivalent of a congressional campaign spending $5 million solely on turnout, not on persuasion messaging, but solely on turnout. And so this is really, really robust and can really make a difference. Before we get to the Q&A, and as a reminder, if you do have questions, please put them in that Q&A folder. I want to ask you to make a contribution. Danielle is going to put this donation link in the chat. I ask you to do the following. One, click on it. Just click on it so you have it open. Two, consider that there are only 140 days left until Election Day, and you are here watching this webinar for a reason. You are doing this because you either care deeply about the climate crisis or you care deeply about the democracy crisis, or both. You want to have an impact. And I want to suggest to you that this is that opportunity for impact. We know who our targets are in North Carolina. We literally know them by name and street address. We have hundreds of randomized control trials proving to us which messages work best with which subgroups of those non-voting environmentalists to turn them into new voters. Now, all we need is the money to make it happen. We need the money to make it happen. So make a donation. All donations help. Big donations help even more. And I can also say, thanks to some generous matching donors, we will match your donation. You make a donation right now, it will be matched. At the beginning of this event, I believe we still had $8,000 left in our matching campaign. So donate now, and your donation will be doubled until we max out all of those matching donations. And I believe we still had $8,000 left. So please donate now and donate generously. If you want to spread out your donation, you can see on the donation link, when you open it up, there's a little box you can check to make them recurring monthly donations. We love that. We love that for two reasons. One, it's often easier for our donors. You might want to donate a lot, but you can't do it all at once, so you can spread it out. It's good for us because it helps us budget. We have a good idea of what's coming each month when we add up all these monthly donations. Finally, I'll say, if you want to host an event like this and introduce the Environmental Voter Project to your friends, boy, would we like to hear from you and help to make it happen. We are in the business of meeting people and getting supporters right now because we've got 140 days left in the most consequential set of elections that any of us have ever experienced. And we want to be able to pitch the Environmental Voter Project to you and your colleagues. They won't donate ahead of time. They will just show up and learn about our group, and then we will ask them to make a donation like we are doing today. All right. Last thing I'll just say before we get to Q&A, please, if you haven't done so already, open up that link. Make a generous donation that will be matched And I promise you, you will feel good. All right, let's get to the Q&A. Danielle, what do we got? We got any questions?
We've got a couple good ones, yes. First question, why do you need a control group in North Carolina? Why not message all low propensity environmental voters there?
Really, really great question. Certainly, what I imagine is sort of underlying this question is like, oh my God, this is such an important election. Like, why not message to some people? And I get that sentiment, but it is enormously important for us to always be able to prove to our volunteers and our donors the impact we are having. And I'm not going to pretend like there's not a trade-off. Of course there's a trade-off. Of course there's a trade-off. Would we like to be able to communicate with all of our targets? Yes. But if we didn't have a control group, we didn't have a control group in all of our states, especially the important ones, I can tell you what would happen next year is people would stop donating to the Environmental Voter Project. They would say, oh, all that money that you raised in 2024, what was your impact? And if we didn't have a control group in the really important states, I might be able to say, oh, in Massachusetts or Kansas, we increased turnout X amount. And a savvy donor or volunteer would be like, well, that was Massachusetts or Kansas. That ain't the same as like a big battleground with billions of dollars spent. We want to know if you had an impact even in those really busy states, those states where lots of money was being spent. And so I get it. I totally understand that there is a very serious trade-off here. But part of the reason we have been able to get such amazing results is because we have been able to prove that we're getting those results, which then turns into more volunteers and more donors, which means we can get better results and even better results and even better results. And so that's why we do it. But I don't want to answer so blithely as to make it seem like I don't understand the trade-off. Of course there's a trade-off, but that's why we do it.
Awesome. Another question we received early on in the presentation, but you answered it, and I'm wondering if you can share your slides again and go back just a couple. What are the opportunities to help get out the environmental vote in North Carolina? Just a few slides ago, you had that list. Perfect. So I might jump to one last question that we received from another attendee. But I just wanted to make sure that the person who wrote this question makes sure that they saw this. And then Nathaniel, if you have anything to add, of course, jump in.
Yeah, I'll just say, our voter turnout opportunities are timed for when we think they will have the biggest impact. So, for instance, today we had volunteers calling into New York, into the Hudson Valley of New York and Long Island, some of the really important congressional races there, because New York's state primary is coming up in a week. And now is a really good opportunity to turn non-voters into voters. What we are not doing right now is calling into Georgia. Will Georgia be a really important state? Yeah. But right now, there isn't an election coming right up. And so we're not calling there right now. So for North Carolina, we're going to have a lot of opportunities, but they're going to be tied to specific moments in time where we think they can be most impactful. Coming up soon, over the next few weeks, we're going to be making these vote by mail recruitment calls that I mentioned. But then we aren't going to start up our voter turnout phone campaigns again until October and November. And then that's also when we as a staff will be doing digital ads and direct mail.
Awesome. Thank you. So last question that another person asked, do we know who climate voters say they're going to vote for?
Okay. Good question. So first, let me say the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit. We do not ask people who they are going to vote for. And truth be told, like even groups and campaigns who do ask people who they're going to vote for, it's impossible to measure whether that's accurate because whether you vote or not, or who you vote for is secret. But we do have some public data, and I can tell you this. One, although if you look at people who care about climate change and would prefer government action to address climate change, they are kind of a mixed bunch. Certainly they lean Democratic and they lean progressive, but there are some people who vote Republican who still care deeply about climate and the environment and want government action to address it. But when you isolate these people who list climate as their number one priority over all other issues, just to give you one example of a recent poll, which is the Economist YouGov weekly tracking poll. In their most recent weekly poll, 17% of Joe Biden supporters listed climate as their number one priority. 0% of Donald Trump supporters listed climate as their number one priority. For better or for worse, I know a lot of people wish that climate wasn't as partisan an issue. For better or for worse, at least if you view it through this lens of people who list climate as their number one priority, at this moment in time, it has become extraordinarily partisan. It has become extraordinarily partisan. But I don't want to mislead you into thinking that if that changes, we're going to change. We are a nonpartisan organization, and what we do is we find people who list climate as their top priority who aren't voting, and we get them to vote. Because ultimately, every politician wants to win elections. And whether you're in a purple district or a blue district or a pink district, getting more climate first voters to the polls is going to help move everybody to make policy the right way. All right. Thank you all so much for your wonderful questions, for spending your evening with us. I'm going to just very briefly close things by asking you again to go into the chat and find this donation link. What this donation link does, if you make this donation, it will go right towards our efforts in North Carolina. 2, it will be matched. It will be matched. 3 generous matching donors have agreed to match the funds raised for this election. When we started this event, there was still about $8,000 left in that matching bank. So please act quickly. You want your donation to be matched. And finally, I'll just say, you don't want to have any regrets. We are 20 weeks away from Election Day. 20 weeks. 20 weeks. 20 weeks from now, it will be a Tuesday evening. It'll be 8:55 p.m. on the East Coast. Many of you will be sitting on your couch watching election returns roll in. And if you're anything like me, you're going to be sick to your stomach with anxiety. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry to force you to think about this. But the truth is, you don't want to have any regrets. You don't. You are here for a reason. So please support our work. Let us be your electoral action. Let us go out and turn these non-voters into new voters for you. Nothing would bring us more pleasure than to be able to start reporting back to you on a regular basis about the impact that your donation is having. So please make a donation, make a generous donation this evening. Thank you, Danielle, for all of the work that you do. Our field and research manager, Danielle, who many of you work with on a regular basis. And thank you to all of you for being a part of our work at the Environmental Voter Project. Have a good night, folks.